So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our first speaker today, which is Matt East from Talis, who's going to be talking to us about shoe experts. Matt, do you want to take over?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Good morning, everyone. As Chris said, my name's Matt. I work at Talis and I'm Learning Technologies lead there. This is not a sales pitch, I'd like to clarify. I'm going to be talking today about a project that we have undertaken with a colleague from the University of Sussex, which is a really good study, I think, around a concept called active online reading. Firstly, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yes, you can. Brilliant. Thank you. Okay. So, can I move my screen? Brilliant. So, firstly, I thought it would just be actually worth starting with what the hell is a shoe expert? And this is a phrase I was saying to Chris earlier. I kind of fell in love with when I first heard it because it felt so relevant to some of the issues that we've faced. And I'm sure that many of you have actually been there. But when you're standing in a lecture room and you've constructed your content or your teaching approach around the idea that students should have, you're expecting students to engage with some resources, be it some weekly reading or some weekly watching or something like that. And you turn up to the class and you ask the class, who's done the reading this week, and all of you students stare at their feet. And you're greeted with utter silence. And this is certainly something that I've experienced in my previous life as a learning technologist or supporting teaching on various modules. And it's a real problem, and it's a real problem that many of us face, and it's a real problem for a number of different reasons. And so a number of different approaches and practices have been attempted by colleagues over the years to engage students in different ways and to kind of try and construct some kind of dialogue between students. But this can often can be greeted with a lack of engagement. And actually, when I joined Talis, I spent quite a lot of time working or speaking with students and researching with students across the sector into why they feel they can't actually contribute to seminar-based conversation or lecture-based conversation, and what the problems are with activities around just go off and read it. And a common thing that we heard back was a quote like this from a student at Sussex, where actually the whole process of engaging with resources can be quite isolating. And a real problem that is often greeted is either the anxiety around I've just got this completely wrong, or I've completely misinterpreted it, or actually I don't want to speak out in front of my class because I don't have the confidence to do that. I don't want to show that I have an opinion which could be different on the module in front of all of my peers. And so that kind of anxiety can drive a lack of engagement in many ways, in my opinion. So when we started delving into this problem with my colleague from the University of Sussex, Dr. Wendy Garnham, she mentioned this concept of shoe experts and the fact that she had tried a number of initiatives over the years to engage students in taking more of an active role in independent study, but also trying to create a collaborative environment where students can really interact with each other and feed off each other and co-construct knowledge with each other around the subject matter. And as I said, she wants students to stop being shoe experts and to take a much more active approach to their studies. And I think I'm probably preaching to the converted here, but I love using this example of the value that working together can offer to the whole kind of learning landscape. The video that's showing at the moment is a project that was called Place on a social network called Reddit. And the concept here was that every user could place a coloured pixel on this white canvas. And initially when it started off, people were working on their own. And then actually once collaboration started to occur, something arguably beautiful, but I'd say kind of wonderful started to occur, and you started to see tribes and different pockets of activity that were occurring, and actually this co-construction enabled something really, really quite awesome to happen. And I think we've certainly observed the same thing in teaching. So for all of that, what does that actually mean? So within this project that I'm talking about today, just to provide a bit of context, the activity that we undertook here was on a foundation course. So these were pre-undergraduate students who were coming in from going to the University of Sussex across a number of different degrees. So the students on this course varied from psychology to history to music, cultural studies, business, law, etc. And for any of you who've taught interdisciplinary modules, you'll appreciate the the complexities and the challenges that can come from those, particularly when you're dealing with such a large cohort of students. But I think what's really important to mention here is that over previous years of this module being delivered, which was a Foundations in Social Psychology module, Wendy had found it really quite challenging to engage students with resources, with the key readings. She tried initiatives like discussion boards, for example, to try and coax some conversation, and that often failed. And in the words of Wendy herself, she found she was just taking comments that students had emailed her and posting those back into the discussion board and having a great conversation with other academics on the module, but not really with students. So what we did, and where I came in with this, was using the product that I'm involved in, which is called Talis Elevate. We introduced a concept around these weekly readings in a kind of flip methodology. So we introduced these resources to students, which were often open educational resources on a wide variety of topics, but also including things like YouTube videos to spark some conversation and debate about certain perspectives on the subject matter. And we asked students to actually just annotate their thoughts, to collaboratively annotate and start conversations around these resources ahead of the seminar activity. And the way that we really introduced this was trying to make this as accessible as possible for students, particularly feeding in on the issues that we spoke around earlier of the anxiety of contribution and that type of thing. So we introduced very early into this approach the fact that students could anonymously comment on these resources, and they could choose to do so every time they wrote a comment or they replied to somebody. We started off the activity with some very guided questions from within these resources. So Wendy would actually go in and just start posing some questions, 3 or 4 throughout each of these resources, to try and coax some conversation. And as I say, this was a weekly activity the students knew was going to be an expectation on them. And it was communicated very early on that the seminar activity would be guided by the contributions that students made. And what we observed, I think, quite early on was some really interesting findings. So the anonymity feature that we introduced and we publicised was used quite extensively in the first couple of weeks. As I say, there were 200 students on this course, and as you can see on this slide now, about 30% overall of the cohort contributed to the conversation within Talis Elevate in some way, shape, or form. But we saw that actually the anonymity use tailed off quite dramatically by about week 3. Wendy had used guided questions for the first couple of weeks, but then actually by week 3, in fact, by week 2, she realised that students were taking ownership over these conversations. They weren't just responding to the guided questions; they were starting their own dialogue within different parts of the resources and taking real ownership. We also observed that students were having a real dialogue between each other. They were, there was a lot of agreeing and disagreeing. There was a lot of counter argument. There was a lot of discussion that was occurring, which was, for me, was fabulous to see. And Wendy particularly cited, I think, that the impact that she felt this had on seminars. The conversation that had occurred within within the flipped activity meant that students were coming armed to seminars with a much broader concept or understanding of their peers' thoughts on the subject matter. There was a much greater level of criticality around the content that she observed previously. And actually, I thought I would include a couple of the comments or the contributions that students made. And something that really blew me away here was a comment that Wendy made, which was actually around the types of contribution and again the criticality. Remember that these are foundation level students, and this is the first time the first module that they've undertaken at university, where they've really had to interact with journal articles and with academic literature. And I think you'll agree that, obviously without the context, it's kind of difficult to comment on the quality of the contribution. But the level that I'm observing here of the contribution, and again the criticality, I think was really impressive for me, and particularly for Wendy. So for me, I think this concept of collaborative annotation or active online reading is proving to be quite exciting, really. What we've observed from students and from staff is that the level of engagement that can occur both online and in the face-to-face environment is pretty impressive. The fact that this can have an impact on things like seminar environments is obviously hugely positive, and we are time poor. We're arguably even more time poor now with everything that's going on. And so any way that we can ensure that we're utilising seminar time effectively as possible should only be really seen as a good thing for me. I think what's particularly exciting here is that we observed a fundamental shift from the academic being the driver of conversation to really actually just sort of facilitating conversation. And I'm sure that's something that we would all want to see more of in any kind of academic discourse, really. So I'm not just talking about one approach here. I think from my perspective, regardless of the technology that you use, this kind of concept of active online reading can be applied in a number of different ways. So a couple of examples that I give here. Pre-seminar conversation is the type of thing that Wendy has undertaken on this module. I'm a big fan of, I need to find a better title for this, but periphery subject matter. So if we're providing students with a resource to read, for example, actually there will probably be something that's related on something like YouTube, and there are tools out there now which will allow you to have conversations around YouTube content, in a really contextual manner. That could be really quite powerful at engaging students and getting them to think outside the box around the subject matter. Around assessments and literacy, we've seen this concept work really well for things like getting students to effectively peer review previous submissions related to your subject matter, or even things like ethics submissions as well, to get a really fundamental understanding of what is being looked for in a module, on the module. Using this type of approach to collaboratively engage with and annotate resources in something like a team session or a Zoom activity. One of my personal favourites, trying to get students to actually think about both sides of the argument. I could see this kind of for and against approach working really well in things like sociology, law, criminology. There's a number of different courses where this can apply, and I'm sure you'll have much better knowledge for me than I do. But the key thing here is obviously around context, and I think where this type of approach around collaborative annotation and active online reading really differentiates itself from tools and systems we've used previously, is that it's so context specific. You can have a very detailed conversation about a very detailed part of a resource that is much more difficult to do and less integrated, I guess, with the resources in something like a discussion board. So that's it from me. I'm going to stop talking now and try and eat my breakfast. So thank you very much for listening. If you've got any questions after this, please feel free to email me. And now I'll go back to Chris.
Cheers, Matt. Just as we got a couple of seconds, has anybody got any questions for Matt? If you want to throw them into the chat.
I'm not sure I can see the chat.
So I'll read them to you.
Okay. Can I ask a question?
Go for it.
Has anyone else done any kind of collaborative annotation or social annotation activities before, and what have your observations been on that? Have you seen anything wildly different to what I've talked about today?
So I've seen some stuff. I mean, personally, I'll open that up to the chat. Has anybody done collaborative annotation or group annotations before? I've seen it done before with a group sat round a table with a printout and highlighters and trying to draw out. I saw that I think it was an event in, I want to say Leeds, actually. It was a teaching learning conference I went to a few years ago. And the really interesting thing was that each group had pulled out entirely different meanings from the text based on the formulation of the group. Oliver, will PowerPoint slides be available afterwards? They absolutely will do, yes. But I'm also going to be making recordings available afterwards as well.
So I guess for most of the last 2,500 years, we've done this by giving the students something to read a week in advance, and then they write their notes on it on a different piece of paper. and compare those with each other, and then they come and have a seminar about it. So what is the big advantage of this over that traditional approach?
I think well, the fact that this works across multiple formats, for one thing. I'm not questioning the fact that there's a lot of prior history here. One of the things that we've found really, we've heard from students quite a lot, is that actually, because that conversation can occur in a resource that lives within the VLE, they can go back to that contribution. They can go back to that conversation and use that as part of their prep for assignments, for example. And also the fact that students can very quickly interchange from within the VLE between the class conversation and the independent study. Those are the key things that have come back from us from students.
So there is something in the chat as well. So Ellen says she's done it in person with small groups in seminars, but this is often led by the same students. So the pre-work engagement here is really important, which is why she's preempting she's expected to be quite fond of Talis. Matt Hall says, I've seen it done well with legal judgments. Yeah, one would hope, right?
Sorry, with what?
Legal judgments.
I didn't hear that again.
Legal judgments.
Right. Okay. And that's exactly the kind of thing I
law
see
stuff.
Yeah.
Which is quite good, because actually, we often have the issue that students, even quite third year students, read them and don't quite pick up the key message or the key line, as it were. So actually, I have seen situations where students have said, "Oh, well, that's this," and probably I've seen them done physically, as Chris was saying, with around a table rather than sort of online, but definitely still would work that way.